Good evening. I want to thank everybody for coming out. This is the third talk in our spring speaker series. Clearly some people didn't get the hat memo. Sorry about that. I think you had to scroll down to find the information that Matthew prepared about changeover hat day. In the winter, the gentlemen wore their felt hats, and May 1 they changed over to straw hats. I didn't know that, but I know now. So I'd like to thank the program committee for organizing this event, and particularly the parish church and the staff for allowing us to use this terrific space. So thank you so much. And to Nancy Klebart, who organizes a lot behind the scenes. So please mark your calendars for our summer soiree at the lovely Shark's Mouth Estate on June 5th. There's going to be more information on the website about that, so look out for that. And also please join the museum if you haven't done that already, and you'll get to hear about all the great programs that we have coming up. Tonight we're really delighted to have historian and furniture expert Professor Brock Jobe, who's going to talk to us about the Manchester furniture industry. In 2000, Brock was appointed Professor of American Decorative Arts in the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture after a 28-year career as a museum curator and administrator at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, Colonial Williamsburg, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, SPINA as we used to call it, but it's now Historic New England, and the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, where he is currently. He has authored and edited 7 books. He has written dozens of articles and given hundreds of lectures. Brock retired from his professorship in June 2015, but retains an office at Winterthur and continues to study, write, and lecture about American furniture. Does anybody know where Winterthur is? Which state? Delaware. Right, I didn't know, so I found out. So Brock serves as president of the Decorative Arts Trust and remains a dedicated volunteer at Winterthur. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brock Jobe.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, that's too bad. I am thrilled to be here. Absolutely thrilled. I want to make a couple of announcements before we get underway. First of all, reference was made to Winterthur, and something that I truly enjoy, probably more than anything, except 2 grandchildren, is showing Winterthur to the public. And I make this claim, and I make it not lightly, but seriously. If any of you, at some point, are traveling to the great state of Delaware, the first state, and would like to spend a couple of hours with me going through the collection, looking at what we have to offer, I encourage you to reach out to me. It's very easy. My email address, bjobe@winterthur.org. And if you don't know how to spell Winterthur, then Google it. I'm sure you'll find it. But I love taking people through, and I invite you to get in touch with me. And we can have a lot of fun looking at more than 5,000 pieces of furniture. And we will look at all 5,000. So find yourself a room. We have multiple bedrooms at Winterthur. Many beds, and I'm sure there's one there that has your name on it. The other announcement I wanted to make is a thank you. And that is, I want to pay special thanks to Matthew Swindell, your director, who actually, I spent the afternoon with Matthew. We were looking at some furniture over in the museum, but also he was educating me about some of the people whom I will be discussing tonight. I thought it would be very appropriate as an image to kick this talk off with this one, which actually is the first page in the daybook, the very first daybook kept by Cyrus Dodge here in Manchester. And you're going to hear quite a bit about the Dodge family and their importance as furniture makers. But we're very, very fortunate at Winterthur to have the Dodge manuscript collection, which includes literally boxes upon boxes upon boxes of documents relating to the Dodge firm, including this very early daybook, which represents Cyrus Dodge's initial foray into cabinet making when he went out on his own in 1841. I think it's important in talking about the role of Manchester to put it in a bit of perspective for just a moment. And here we have a map from the late 19th century of Essex County, and I've highlighted 8 circles to identify 8 different seaports. And I do this simply to make what, for me, is one of the most extraordinary facts about furniture history in New England, is that these 8 towns in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century produced not hundreds, not thousands, not tens of thousands, but certainly approaching well over 100,000 pieces of furniture during this period. These were critical sites for furniture making, real centers of production, beginning with Newburyport at the top of the screen, Ipswich, Gloucester, obviously Manchester that we'll talk about tonight, Beverly, Salem, Marblehead, and down at Lynn, closer to Boston. And we often lose sight of just how significant furniture making was in every one of these communities, particularly in the 18th and I would say the first half of the 19th century. Each has its own story to tell. And to be honest, the stories have not been told for some of these communities. Very little is known about what was going on in Lynn in the 18th century, and yet there were major furniture makers working in Lynn, producing hundreds, if not thousands of pieces, not only for local consumption, but for shipment up and down the coast and to far, far distant ports. I think that's for me. But it's important as we think about Manchester just to remember how significant the entire region was along the coast. And you have to ask yourself why. And it comes back to shipping and the importance of these communities as entrepôts, as places from which furniture makers could ship their products not only up and down the Atlantic coast, but they could ship them to the Caribbean, to the coast of South America, or in the case of the wonderful documents that survive to tell us about Salem shipping, we know that pieces were going to the coast of India, making their way to Calcutta from Salem in the first decade of the 19th century, to Mauritius, and thinking about shipments to those kind of far away places. I always like to illustrate this extraordinary gentleman's secretary at Winterthur, which in 1912 was discovered in Cape Town, South Africa. And indeed, all of the documentation suggests that this particular piece had made its way from Salem to Cape Town and was acquired there in the late 1790s on one of those export voyages, probably heading to the Mauritius area, to the islands there, to the east of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, but making stops in Cape Town. And in many cases, these pieces would have been sold at auction in these various cities. But to think about a piece like this turning up in Cape Town in the late 1790s.
Sure, right here.
Yeah.
Sorry, what are they?
Now, when it comes to Manchester furniture making, one of the best sources to start with is Lamson's History of the Town of Manchester. And I just want to quote one of the comments that's made right at the very beginning of his chapter on furniture making. The history of cabinet making in Manchester is a history, like most things, that have come to greatness of small beginnings. And indeed, the story of Manchester furniture making begins in a very small way, with only a couple of craftsmen. Now, one of those craftsmen was a man named Caleb Knowlton. And we're very fortunate at the Peabody Essex Museum that they have a piece that is signed by Caleb Knowlton. Knowlton was born in Wenham. He also had connections in Beverly. He marries a woman here in Manchester and is working as a cabinet maker here in Manchester, and makes this particular piece of furniture in 1808. Now, Knowlton is important, and you'll see as we progress in this presentation, how one person trains another, who trains another, who trains another. And in fact, Knowlton is not only important for the history of Manchester because of some of the furniture that can be documented to him here in this city, in this town, but also because of people that he trained. What I find interesting about Caleb Knowlton is that all of these towns, whether we speak of Salem or Lynn or Manchester, they go through periods of prosperity and periods of economic travail. And it was certainly the case here in Manchester with the outbreak of the War of 1812. And Knowlton found the situation in Manchester a challenging one. And so he leaves about 1812, makes his way to the far reaches of Brandon, Vermont, which is actually right near the New York border, south of Middlebury, Vermont. And I just find it absolutely fascinating that here is a fellow who is making furniture right here in Manchester in 1808. And just a few short years later, he's making, in essence, the same furniture in Brandon, Vermont, showing you how styles, how techniques of production can pass across the states and make their way, and in his case, into really that borderland with New York State and Lake Champlain. But Knowlton is also an important figure in our story because it is thought that this gentleman, whose name is synonymous with furniture making and woodworking in Manchester, supposedly John Perry Allen learned his trade from Caleb Knowlton. Now, Allen, and those of you who know anything about the history of Manchester and know about the furniture making efforts here in this city are probably familiar with Allen's name because he is certainly the most significant figure before the American Civil War here in Manchester. And why is he significant? Well, I think certainly he was able to develop a large-scale furniture-making operation right here in town. But more importantly, he was able to invent a type of veneer saw that allowed him, in his sawmill, which the initial mill was built just not a few steps from here, in that sawmill, he was able to come up with a way of slicing veneers. And again, when you think of veneers, we're talking about thin, at this time, probably 1/16 of an inch thick strips of, in his case, mahogany, that he was able to cut in a way that had the least amount of sawdust, in other words, the least amount of waste. He could get more sheets of veneer out of a log than just about anybody else could at the time. And there was a huge demand in the 1820s and 30s when he is coming into his own as a furniture maker and a sawmill operator. There's a huge demand for these flamboyant veneers, such as what you see in the screen on the right. Now that's a Boston, what's called a secrétaire habitant, and the upper panel of that piece folds down to reveal a writing compartment. And then 2 doors below, it was a very popular French form that was adapted both in England and America. And Boston makers produced hundreds of these. In all likelihood, many of the veneers that decorate these Boston secrétaire habitants or other pieces of Boston furniture of this period would have been cut right here in Manchester at Allen's sawmill. And he was shipping massive amounts of these mahogany veneers up and down the coast. He was also involved in a trade with the American South. And as we'll see in just a moment, that story of trade with the American South becomes even more prominent with his son-in-law, Charles Lee. But you see the miniature of John Perry Allen, very successful gentleman. I'm just going to show you, I hate to have you endure a couple of quotes, but I think they're very important ones for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about the significance of Allen. And both of these come from Lamson's history of the town of Manchester. Mr. Allen was one of those who experimented in this direction, meaning he was experimenting in the craft and the art of cutting veneers. He builds a mill for this purpose in 1825 on the site of the old Tidewater grist mill, which he had bought from the town. The sawing of veneers, once he comes up with this way to cut veneers in a very efficient way, the sawing of veneers now became a principal part of Mr. Allen's increasing business. His plant consisted of 2 upright saws, 4 veneering saws, jig saws, turning lathes, and what's most important is that in 1835, he places a steam engine in his mill, which supplied veneers, as Lamson says, for most of the furniture and piano establishments in the United States. Now, Mr. Lamson, I think, was prone to hyperbole just a bit. I'm not sure that that is actually accurate, but the truth lies perhaps a little below this. Nevertheless, I think it's important for us to recognize just how significant this supply chain was, from mahogany coming here from the Caribbean, being sliced into veneers or cut into planks here in Manchester, and then going out to up and down the coast to cabinet makers, whether they be in Boston or Salem or further south, and furniture being made with those Manchester sliced veneers. It's really quite an amazing story. Now, regrettably, and there's always a caveat, John Perry Allen was a very successful man. He did well, but he also experienced many hardships. And one of the greatest occurred just a year after he acquired that steam engine, when he experiences a fire. And it's a fire in that very building with the steam engine, the steam sawmill. Great fire at Manchester on Sunday morning about 1 o'clock. And this would have been, this is from the Pittsfield Sun, this was reported in all the newspapers. I mean, this was major front page news for many of these Massachusetts and New England papers. The steam sawmill belonging to John Perry Allen of Manchester was discovered to be on fire. And before the flames could be subdued, 4 dwelling houses, 3 not insured, 5 cabinet maker shops, the steam sawmill, 2 barns, and other smaller buildings were totally destroyed, together with a large lot of mahogany, veneers, new furniture, lumber, and tools. I mean, this is devastating. Allen did have some insurance. He was able to secure somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 back in insurance. But the thought, the papers go on to comment that the total losses in that time period were in the neighborhood of $70,000 to $100,000, which was a monumental amount of money. So this was a significant loss. And it certainly did deter Allen. However, as Matthew pointed out to me today, Allen had multiple mills on streams in the Manchester area. And he did continue to do this work, but this was a very significant loss. Now, to give you a sense of the scale of his operation, he employed over 100 workmen. And in the 1830s, that's a significant number. Now, later you get into the textile mills where they're important, in which you have thousands of people finding jobs. But at this period, 1835, this is a large furniture making operation. Now, I mentioned that that Allen had a son-in-law, Charles Lee. And I want to take a moment to talk about Lee, because we have far more furniture that can be ascribed to Lee. And I'll point out why in just a moment. Regrettably, there is very little, if any. I haven't seen a single piece of furniture that can be ascribed conclusively to John Perry Allen, and yet we know he made thousands of pieces, but there is not a single object that bears a label or any kind of documentation to Allen. So he remains a bit of a mystery in terms of what he made. But he was extremely prolific, very prominent in town. He had very close ties to the South. And while we think of the abolitionist movement here in New England, there were also other people here in New England who did not support abolition. And John Perry Allen was one of those. His son-in-law, Charles Lee, learned his trade of cabinet making and the business of running a factory from John Perry Allen. And the story of Lee is a fascinating one because for many, many years in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, antique dealers in the South noticed they were marks like the ones that you see on the screen. These are just stamped marks, C. Lee, and then numbers, 64, 67. And these were all appeared on these magnificent, monumental beds in some of the great plantation houses along the Mississippi. And at one point they were thought to represent the work of a craftsman in New Orleans, because many of these pieces came with New Orleans histories. But in fact, what we discovered, and when I say we, I really want to give credit to a student who, in the Winterthur Program, back in the 1990s, a fellow named Stephen Harrison, who really cracked the code on this and was able to prove that the C. Lee that appeared on those marks refers to Charles Lee of Manchester, Massachusetts. And Lee was responsible for a major export trade, sending beds to places like Melrose, one of these great houses in Natchez. Those beds ultimately end up in structures like this one. And just to give you a sense of what they look like, and I'm going to show you a whole series of them. And I don't know how many of you need a 12-foot high bed, and but I'll tell you, now is the time to buy. Because I'm going to show you a few of them that sold back 20 years ago, and the prices were a lot more than they are right now. You can get these beds reasonably. And every bed I'm going to show you, I'll show you, I don't know, half a dozen or so, all of them are marked C. Lee. And they were all made right here in Manchester. And they would have been shipped, and most likely shipped directly to New Orleans. And then from New Orleans, make their way up the Mississippi to other cities along the river. And I think, and some of you may well be familiar with this image, and again, there's a wonderful exhibit in the Historical Museum, which includes this image of Charles Lee's furniture making establishment. This is a photograph from about 1865. Now, Lee is primarily involved in sending these beds to southern ports in the pre-Civil War period, so the 1850s. But he does continue on into the 1860s, as you see here. And I make reference to the fact that he, in the case of Natchez, Mississippi, he had a direct agent who was another cabinet maker, Robert Stewart, who was selling these beds on behalf of Lee. And as I noted here, Lee had initially worked for Allen, and he married Allen's daughter. But let's just look at a few of these beds. Again, I'm going to show you a range of them. And again, I make reference to the article which appeared in 1994, in which Stephen Harrison, actually as he was doing the research for his Winterthur thesis, was able to pin down the connection between Lee and these beds. This example, and we'll just go through them quickly. Here's one that came up for sale in 2004 and brought $16,000. I can guarantee you, have I got a bed for you? I can guarantee you can probably buy one of these today for a quarter of that. If that, for a quarter of that. They've come way down in price. But then, that's the plight of brown wood. Here's another one that sold in 2003 for almost $15,000. I mean, they are majestic objects. And again, you're looking at the bedstead, and you have to imagine this with the most luscious, lavish hangings that would really be extraordinary. Another one, So again, this one sold for just under $14,000. Again, that was the going price back then. They have come down considerably. And again, just getting a range. These were all made here in Manchester. Every one of them.
Did he do the carving?
He had, the question was, did he do the carving? Again, he had a factory in which he had specialists, so certain individuals would be involved in doing any kind of turned work on a lathe. Other people would be involved in carving. Some people would be involved in the veneering. Some people would be involved in just the assembly process. And it would be divided up by specialty. And then just one other piece I wanted to show you, which again is here across the street, because it has a history of having been exported to the South. Or it was supposed to have gone to the South, as I've noted here, but it did not make it. But this is the kind of thing that was being produced here in Manchester for these large southern houses, making their way there in the late 1850s and in the early 1860s until, in this case, the blockade prevented it. Now, let me move on to really, in many ways, I think, the star of our show, and that is the Dodge Furniture Company. And many of you, I've talked to several of you here who knew Charlie Dodge, and really, this is a marvelous story, and it's a story that is not repeated in that many communities. Oftentimes, with the individuals I'm discussing prior to this, Charles Lee, John Perry Allen, it's a one-generation business. And in many cases, it doesn't even make it through that generation. Somebody starts a business, it flourishes for 10, 15, 20 years, and then changing economic conditions put an end to the business. And it dies, and that's it. But in the case of the Dodge Furniture Company, it's really a great story of continuity. Continuity in over a time period in which styles change, fashions change, the way in which the furniture was being made changes, and yet the company was able to continue over a long period of time. And just to recount the key figures, it begins with Moses, who, unfortunately, there is a tilt-top table at the museum that has a history of having been made by Moses Dodge, who's working in the 1760s and 70s here. But we know very little about what he might have made here. And then we've got, really, we skip a generation, and the grandson of Moses is Cyrus. But then you have a continuous line, Cyrus, and the three sons of Cyrus, and then Charlie, who takes it over in 1926 from his uncle. But the work of Cyrus and the work of the second generation there, the three brothers, is very different in many respects from what Charlie Dodge is making. So just to bring this point home, let me just show you, first of all, and some of you have seen these images before. Here is the Dodge Furniture Company, the old mill. And what I love is this image in which, and some of you, again, may have seen this, for certain parades here in town back in the early years of the 20th century, a parade float showing a recreation of the mill was put on a cart and simply wheeled through town as part of a parade ceremony. And that's what you see here. And in fact, the museum has several photographs of different parades showing this wonderful Dodge mill float. And then here is another view of the mill. And again, it's not a huge building. As I noted here, it was erected in 1847. And that day book that I showed you at the very beginning with that wonderful florid hand of Cyrus Dodge, that day book contains the specific acquisitions by Dodge for creating this mill, including the references to the steam machinery that he acquired. He spent $1,000 on the steam machinery so that this could be a steam-powered mill. And again, water power was not something you could count on with certainty. Steam gave you that certainty. And so all of these companies, and again, the larger companies that crop up in places like Gardner, Massachusetts, they all are relying on steam power for their powered equipment. And among the powered equipment were a variety of machinery. And again, this is Charles Dodge showing you, and this is from a Yankee magazine article from the 50s, showing the use of a Daniels planer, which is a machine literally to plane a board smooth. And this dates back to the very end of the 19th century, and they were still using some of the earlier power equipment, but this was belt-driven, steam-powered equipment. It was quite an amazing factory. And then he had a variety of people working. This is, again, when Charlie Dodge is running the operation, and he has a variety of specialists. Someone who might be doing carving, someone who would do turning, or someone who would do the joinery work. But as we think about the Dodge company, it's important to break it into kind of two components. Because when you think of Cyrus, and you think of that next generation of the three brothers, you have to ask yourself, what were they making? Well, they were making what's oftentimes simply called Victorian furniture today. Now, these are not Dodge pieces, but I think you can rest assured that Cyrus and actually his brothers, his three sons, are doing work of the same type. And in fact, Cyrus in his book makes reference to, his day book makes reference to making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of so-called French chairs that he's producing in an enormous quantity. Chairs like this. Now this was made in the Rufus Stanley shop here in Manchester, but this is the same kind of thing that would have been produced by the Dodge firm as well. And what I find fascinating about this chair, which is over in the museum, is that there's documentation to suggest that the actual carving on the chair was done by Andre Ruffin at the age of 17. And again, a lot of these craftspeople who are working in these shops, some are native to Manchester, but a lot are coming in from elsewhere. And we're going to see a wonderful example of that at the very end of the talk, which I guarantee you is coming. It's coming. And then when you think about the Dodges, you also have to think about other firms that are working in this same Victorian period in the late 19th century. And Rust and Marshall is another one. Again, these are firms that can be identified on some of the Manchester maps that are over in the museum. But in the case of Rust and Marshall, again, they're working in a Victorian, or you might call this a Rococo revival style from the 1860s. But this would be the kind of furniture that's being produced by the Dodges at that time. And here's just one other example. From the same time period, an upholstered rocking chair. And just all of the carving that you see is going to be hand carved. It's important to emphasize that. Anytime you see the carving on these pieces, this is all handwork. And it's the most time-consuming aspects of these products. And then last of all, and again, I know you've all walked past this piano, which is really quite a marvelous 1870s example of the Rococo revival. But now, let's fast forward to what were the Dodges doing in the early 20th century. And this is where everything changes. And you find the movement away from those revival styles, Rococo revival, Gothic revival, and you're moving into what's oftentimes called a colonial revival today. And so much of what Charlie Dodge was making was in that colonial revival style. And Winterthur has literally hundreds of photographs like this, showing you the variety of furniture that was being produced. Much of it custom, but custom based on designs that they had mastered. In other words, a bed like this would have a certain pattern number, and they would replicate this bed over and over and over again. But it's very much in that colonial revival tradition. And I just show you other examples here, both in terms of, this is really a classic example of a very closely modeled reproduction of a circa 1800 so-called urn-back or shield-back chair that is of the type that would have been produced by Charlie Dodge. And in fact, his firm did produce these. This is all part of the Dodge archive at Winterthur. Or tables like this. Again, a simple gate leg table. The originals date from about 1720. This is from about 1920, 1930. And this form of furniture continues to be made throughout Charlie's period once he takes over in 1926. And this is the last one that I wanted to show you, which is kind of a really imaginative use of the colonial revival. Very creative example. And probably dates right around 1900. And this would have been when the three brothers were still running the shop. And just to give you, I won't bore you with lots of pictures of the business records, of which we could spend days going through them, but I just wanted to pull one out because many of you may be familiar with the old Payne Furniture Company. And the Dodge firm was making pieces for Payne's. Again, these would typically be custom order pieces that the Payne Furniture Company would acquire. And you'll notice references to sets of antique armchairs. So he's replicating an antique in some cases. And that brings me to really the final two things I want to talk about tonight. In reviewing all the material for this talk, I was hunting for something new that I could share with you and say, this has never been seen before. And thankfully, a couple of people came to my rescue and actually tipped me off to a couple of pieces of furniture that I'd like to share with you tonight. Now, I have to be honest and tell you that outside of the rest of you that are in the audience, there are probably only myself and one other person in the world who cares. and you don't have any choice. But so there are two of us who really get excited about this kind of thing. Okay, the photograph which you see on the left is a photograph of the Lyman family. I believe this was taken at the Vale. And some of you may know the Lyman House, the Theodore Lyman House. It's owned by Historic New England. It's in Waltham. The Lymans also own property here in Manchester. In any event, you see this dressing bureau, what's called a dressing bureau on the left. And when this photograph surfaced, two friends of mine, Robert Mussey and Clark Pierce, were very excited to find this picture. And they actually published the picture in a book that they wrote on the firm of Isaac Vose and Son just a few years ago. And their supposition was that this was another one of these Isaac Vose dressing bureaus, like the one which you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And they published it as such. Well, the piece that you see on the left, just a couple of years ago, came up for sale. And it surfaced at an auction in San Francisco. And Clark Pierce, who also not only did he help write the book with Robert on Vose, but he also is an antiques dealer. He acts as an agent for people interested in buying early American antiques. Well, he got wind of the dressing bureau, and he realized that this was the one that was in the photograph. And I mean, he matched up the grain of the wood, he looked at every detail. He said, this is the piece. So he's feeling so happy that he's made this discovery. And he buys the dressing bureau, gets it back to the East Coast, and he and Robert are going through the piece, hoping that they will find the stenciled label of Isaac Vose. Well, they find documentation, but it's not Isaac Vose. There's the inscription by William F. Chisholm saying that he made this piece in 1882 here in Manchester. And it is an absolutely exact replica of an example akin to what we just saw in the last series of images. And so Robert Mussey, well, needless to say, Clark was distraught because he had paid, let's just say, a certain amount of money expecting it to be an 1820 Vose piece, and it turned out to be an 1882 Manchester piece. Well, what do you do with it? You know, you can't sell it as period. But Robert Mussey was so excited to find the piece and know about it. So ultimately, he ends up buying it as a gift for his wife. And you see it now in his wife Carol's, in her bedroom, and in Milton, Mass. And, but it led down a rabbit hole. Who is William Chisholm? Name didn't surface but Robert, who is an indefatigable researcher, I mean, remarkable guy in terms of his ability to ferret out information. And he was able to track Chisholm, who was born in Nova Scotia, comes to, as a young man, comes to Manchester, probably goes to work, we think, for the Dodge firm. And he specializes in really fine quality reproductions. And again, the Dodges were called upon to do this kind of thing. And what we believe happened is that members of the Lyman family, you know, they inherited one bureau. There were two kids. What do? Well, you give one, you give the period bureau to the son you like, and you give the replica to the daughter you are too kind, you know, or vice versa. But clearly it was something along that line that happened. But the quality of this piece is really remarkable. And I have a couple of details to show you, just to illustrate. Now, on the right, you see the dovetailing for the period example by Vose. And it's, Vose is really, I mean, when it comes to furniture construction in the early years of the 19th century, it's as fine as anything you will see made anywhere in America. and he's using mahogany for his drawer sides, as well as mahogany veneer on mahogany for the drawer front. But the Chisholm piece is nothing to sneeze at. This is very capable work, and the entire piece, if you went over the whole piece, it's equally fine. So this is a really exceptional craftsman. And he was able to acquire really magnificent hardware. On the right, you see the example of the period piece. And you'll notice right away one major difference between the two, in that the original example had, in essence, book-matched veneers that were joined at the center of each drawer front. And that seam is largely hidden by the escutcheon plate. Whereas on the other example, it's a single sheet of mahogany veneer applied to a secondary wood, which is a tropical secondary wood. It's not mahogany, but it's another tropical wood. Now, at the time, in the late 19th century, you couldn't quite get the same quality of mahogany that you had access to in the 18-teens and 20s. And you know, I'd like to think that the mahogany on that original piece was actually lumbered right here in Manchester by John Perry Allen. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But if you look carefully at the hardware, now again, neither maker would have made the hardware. They would have acquired the hardware. The example on the right is almost certainly really fine quality English-made hardware. But the example on the left, we don't know where it was made, but it almost looks like it was taken as a casting from an original piece. It's really quite close, and if you look carefully, you'll see that it's been turned upside down. And then a last-minute discovery, as if that wasn't enough. A good friend who's here tonight told me about a suite of furniture that had come down in his family that had a note attached to it, and the note said, "Sofa, made by Leach of Manchester," and it went into a house that was built in 1852. So presumably this piece would have dated from sometime shortly after 1852. And again, I want to thank Matthew, who helped me greatly this evening as I look at the sofa, which is one of the things you have to keep in mind as you're looking at this furniture is think about who are your clients. So many of these pieces are going into some of these houses right here along the coast, right? You know, that are going up, these summer cottages that are going up, and this is really good summer cottage furniture. But I became keenly interested over the last 3 hours in who was Leach. And again, thanks to Matthew, we determined that we're referring to Daniel Leach, who I gave his dates, 1822, he dies in 1897. He was trained as a cabinet maker, but I think more importantly, he was very highly skilled as a manager of a cabinet making business. He was as much a businessman as he was a cabinet maker. And he, fascinating story about him, and I'll end with this in just a moment. Leach, well, let me back up. 1849, what happens in 1849? Railroads, what else happens?
Gold rush.
What?
Gold rush.
Gold rush, yes, gold rush. And, you know, a lot of people here in Manchester headed west, and they wanted to take part in the gold rush. He was actually planning to head west, and so the story goes in his obituary many years later, his bags were packed. He was out of here. But just before he left, three individuals who were wanted to start another furniture factory here in Manchester, approached him and said, would you take over the management of this new factory? And it clearly was a very intriguing offer, and I assume a very profitable one for him. And because of that, he decided to stay here in Manchester. And he creates the firm of Leach, Annabelle and Company, and I show you the location of it, which you can see in this 1856 map of Manchester, the center of town. But really interesting figure, and I didn't even realize the Leaches were involved in furniture making until I learned about it through the owner of the sofa. So we've come to the end of the talk, and I just want to leave you with a great image, which I have used this image in so many talks on so many different topics because I just love the picture. But I think what's important is the quote that I've attached to it. Again, some of you may know this work, Jeffrey's Creek by Gordon Abbott, which appeared a number of years ago. And it kind of summarizes just how much was going on here in Manchester. Heyday of the industry here was from the early 1800s to about 1850. I'd actually move that forward to about 1870. At its peak, there were about 43 different furniture shops in town, providing employment for hundreds of workers and steady wages for them and for their families. Now, for a town the size of Manchester, at that point, that's a remarkable industry. And while we can look at Ipswich, Newburyport, Lynn, Salem, Beverly, they certainly all had major furniture making operations, but I think per capita, I would have to say that the largest furniture making operation of all of these great towns along the Essex County coast was Manchester. Thank you. Okay, questions? I saw your hand first.
Where were these folks living?
Where were the folks living?
Were they living in town?
Well, I met someone tonight who...
21 School Street.
Yeah, look,
It was
21
Moses Dodge. That's where I grew up.
Yeah,
And then across the street next to the fire station was Cyrus Dodge.
yeah. She lived right in the house where Cyrus Dodge lived,
Where's his grandfather? Moses.
and the grandfather, and Moses as well. Yeah, yeah.
And probably more smart.
But I'm going to have to rely on Matthew. That's his assignment, to figure out where all of these folks live, because, I mean, they clearly filled the town. And I think many of them, like Chisholm, were coming in from outside. You know, he comes in from Nova Scotia. And one other thing that I should have said about Chisholm, he works for a period of time as a furniture maker, and he's very qualified. But he's obviously clearly skilled with his hands. And he eventually gives up cabinet making and goes in and becomes a jeweler and opens a jewelry business here in the town. And he had, I think, I can't remember if it was a brother or a relative who was also involved in the jewelry business in maybe in Gloucester, one of the nearby towns. But I really will have to leave it up to Matthew to tell you where they all live. Yes?
What size were those beds? Did people have to have a special mattress made? Was it bed? Was it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question about they're not really they wouldn't be quite a king size. They're almost a kind of, in terms of width, they're kind of queen size. beds, they're not sheets up. But they are, in terms of the mattresses, there were people who provided mattresses. You could buy mattresses at that time. The mattresses were not something that was coming from here. They would have been made, they would probably have been made in New Orleans, somewhere else.
But today, would somebody have to have a mattress made for those particular beds that they're buying?
Yeah. You would, absolutely. And I mean, and the other factor that comes into this is who would be supplying the curtains? You know, because they all have some sort of draperies, and the draperies would be very expensive, and those would come from other vendors. Not here. They would probably come from New York, Boston, Philadelphia, or New Orleans. Question?
You have the location of the water and the port, and the shipping. You've got typically ports that have rivers or streams coming in, you go in the waterfall. But what about the interaction with the shipping industry in those same locations?
In terms of shipbuilding? Yeah.
In terms of furnishing.
It's a great question, and I've got two answers for you. One, I don't know enough about it to really answer this properly, but you noticed that I didn't say anything about Essex, and Essex was a major shipbuilding, small ships, but still ocean-going ships were made in Essex. Clearly, anybody who's involved in woodworking trades are going to be involved in making things, doing some work for ships as well. But I think by the time you get into the 1840s and 50s, when, say, Charles Lee is doing his work, he's really focused on specialized production. But I'm sure there were others who were doing whatever was needed in the way of woodwork for ships, too. But I don't know enough to really answer that. And regrettably, I've gone through the Cyrus Dodge, and I keep wanting to call him Cyrus Vance. I'm showing my age. But a Cyrus Dodge daybook, shipping does not come up. I mean, in terms of making things for ships, it's just sets of chairs, bureaus, I mean, just, your standard furniture there. Yeah.
David's picture, and which shop was that in? Do we know whose shop that was?
That's a great question. I think the photo is, Matthew, can you help me, remind me when this, I would say right around.
This shop?
Yeah.
I think it's about 1900.
Yeah, I was going to say.
He was a long-lived man. He was particularly a librarian for a long time. But he was a cabinet maker in his life history. So, about 1900.
About 1900. I don't think we know which shop. We can't say with certainty. I mean, maybe it's the Dodge shop. We don't know. And we were talking about this earlier today. The feeling is this is a staged picture. I mean, he was clearly able to do it, and he was trained as a cabinet maker, but it is such a, I mean, I almost feel like I'm looking at the furniture making equivalent of a Wallace Nutting image, historic image. I love the picture. I absolutely love the picture. And I want to talk to the guy so badly. I really do. I just really do. Yeah, question in the back.
Well, I have a question and an apology. My apologies for coming in so late, banging the door on my way in. I was putting two little girls to bed who did not want to go to bed, so I said that.
I've been there.
But my question, and this may show my naivete, but you mentioned the matching mahogany bookend veneer on the dresser in Manchester. And said that the mahogany might have been lumbered here in Manchester.
Right.
I always thought mahogany was a tropical wood, Caribbean and Central American wood.
Yeah. So it would have been shipped either in
Right,
log form or in massive planks.
Milled here.
And then it would have been brought here and milled here. That was the kind of the rule of thumb. And at this point, a lot, in the 1820s and 30s, again, certain islands have been, in essence, clear-cut, completely harvested. And they're relying on British Honduras. So many of the Caribbean islands have been cut. British Honduras, they're going down into South America, in the that Suriname area of those
Well, I was thinking
colonies.
what magical trees used to live here. It's beautiful furniture. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but it's being imported. It's, I hate to say it, it's no different, really, than, you think about today, and the raw materials will come from someplace. They'll go somewhere else. They'll be processed in some way. They'll go somewhere else and be fabricated into the final product. And this is a classic example of that. Everybody is part of that supply chain effort. Let me just take one here. Yeah.
So, some of the fancy beds, were those commissioned by particular individuals, or were they sold generally and they didn't have to
They-
be or anything like that?
My sense is that they were not commissioned individually. The maker, Lee, would have an arrangement with an agent in New Orleans, or it might be Stewart in Natchez. And the idea was Lee would ship 26 beds to Stewart of maybe 2 different types or 3 different types, and then those would be sold locally, as opposed to custom order. Now, I'm sure there were occasional custom orders, but I think a lot of these, and particularly given the numbers and the way they're numbered, they're all kind of standard models. Yeah. Yeah, let me get one more. If somebody who has any.
I'm particularly interested in the southern relationships to New Orleans and to Natchez. And Cape-Ann has a special relationship with Natchez. The Sargent family established themselves. Winthrop Sargent was the governor of the Mississippi Territories, and Natchez and his family stayed on for generations. So they would have had this very close connection right there, for one thing. But I read that CD article many years ago. Do I vaguely remember him saying, I know he was trying to establish the identity, but that some of the materials came up to Manchester but were finished by enslaved laborers in New Orleans?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It's, I can't remember if Stephen Harrison, that he wrote his thesis on this very subject, and I'd have to go back and look. I don't recall what the documentation is. There was a legend. These Lee beds were thought to have been made by enslaved craftsmen in New Orleans, and that really proved to be, false. And the sense is, my sense is the only thing that might have been done in whether it's New Orleans or Natchez would be to deal with the finish.
Yes.
Because you're taking it from one environment to another environment, and a very, very humid environment, and you might have to have somebody, a craftsman of some sort, just apply another coat of varnish to it. I wouldn't think they would be doing anything else for the beds, not the carving.
And then would the Winterthur documentation, would that lend any light on this question, do you think?
Well, the Winterthur, you can access Stephen Harrison's thesis online. And if you just look up Stephen Harrison, I'm almost sure you can get it online. And just do New Orleans furniture, Stephen Harrison, and it should come up. And I would just encourage you to look at that. I just don't remember. I've read it and I read parts of it for this talk, and I don't remember anything. I'm sure he gets into this issue, but I don't remember the specifics.
Raj, you have
Okay.
one more question?
One more question.
One question, just, yeah.
We've got one right here too.
What caused this great industry to die off? And when were the last companies still making furniture?
Well, Charlie Dodge is, and he goes out of business in 1965, I think that was the year. For all intents and purposes, what happened, well, you've got this burst of activity in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And I think a lot of it is fueled by the southern trade and this veneering industry. Now, eventually, other places are able to produce veneers just as well as Perry could, as Allen could. So I would say the heyday is in the 30s, 40s, 50s. When you get into the 60s and 70s, I think their trade changes quite a bit. And you've got local customers. You've got all the building that's going along the coast here. And they're supplying furniture for a lot of those newer structures that are going up. They're always supplying furniture to people in Boston. I mean, this is a market. Manchester is a place that's making furniture that is going down to Boston, and it's being retailed in Boston by so-and-so. So, you buy it in Boston, you may think it's from somebody in Boston, but it was made right here. And that continues on in the 60s and 70s. But then it really comes to an end for a number of reasons. One is that there's greater competition from much larger factories, and particularly in the Midwest, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Grand Rapids, Chicago. They're creating factories, and right here in Massachusetts, in Gardner, you've got all those factories in Gardner at the end of the 19th century. They're producing more than 1 million pieces of furniture a year in Gardner, Massachusetts. You've got Haywood, you've got the wicker industry down in Wakefield. That's just booming. All of that's happening. And these are much smaller operations by comparison. And their day really comes to an end. And it's only somebody like Charlie Dodge who can cater to a really, I would say, knowledgeable clientele who appreciate what he's doing. They develop a relationship with him. I've talked to several people here who knew him, and I mean, you just can feel the good vibe that they had down here. And that kept, I think that as much as anything kept it going. Anyway, thank you.